Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. No one knows how many children suffered the trauma of being forcibly separated from their parents as part of Donald Trump's hapless, misbegotten campaign against immigrants and asylum seekers at our southern border. The number was in the thousands. According to the New York Times, hundreds of children are still being taken from their parents, despite a federal court order requiring the Trump administration to end this horrendously cruel practice. And NBC News is reporting that the backlog of migrant children in federal custody has become so great that kids are being forced to sleep on concrete slabs, on floors with no mats, and even in some cases outside. Kevin McAleenan, the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, has warned that more children will die if they continue to wait in Border Patrol facilities for long periods of time. My guest, Dr. Irwin Redlener, will give us a sense of the profound emotional, psychological, and physical consequences that occur when children as young as toddlers and infants are seized from parents and guardians and thrown into these terrible circumstances. Dr. Redlener, an internationally celebrated pediatrician, is the co-founder and president emeritus of the Children's Health Fund. He is also a professor of pediatrics and director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University and the author of The Future of Us: What the Dreams of Children Mean for 21st Century America. Irwin, welcome. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, Bob. So glad to be here, of course.
I appreciate it. So you've been down at the border, and in fact, you've been working, I believe, with Border Patrol officials on this situation. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found and what your primary concerns at this point are?
Well, this is one of the most extraordinary challenges facing children and families that I've seen in decades of my career. But I think the overall sense is that we have a system of immigration and managing people coming across the border, especially illegally, but a system that is entirely, to use the cliche, broken. We had 76,000 people apprehended in the month of February, 103,000 in March, 110,000 in April, and last month in May we had close to 150,000 people in the course of 1 month apprehended by Border Patrol in between the normal and regular processing centers. So we have a system that is overwhelmed with people who are seeking, and not so much economic sanctuary now. It used to be that the majority of the people coming across the border illegally were Mexicans who were looking for work in the United States, and they would sneak across, but actually also fulfilling very important jobs that no one else would take in agriculture and so on. Now the situation is upside down, with the majority of people coming across being families with children, and also a large number of what's called unaccompanied minors, who are people under the age of 21 or 18 who are waiting to get placed with somebody that is waiting for them somewhere in the United States. But there's an entirely different situation which the government has not been really prepared for.
These folks are coming in, and in so many cases children end up in federal custody. Do you know what happens right after the children are taken into custody? Where do they go, and who looks out for them?
So the initial 72 hours, people that come across the border, children, adults, single adults, or families, are taken into custody by an organization called the Border Patrol, which is under a larger agency called Customs and Border Protection as part of Homeland Security. They're only allowed to keep people for 72 hours by law. But unfortunately, because of the backlog, they're kept now, unfortunately, longer than the 72 hours, sometimes 40, 50% longer. Theoretically, they go from Border Patrol custody to ICE, the notorious ICE, where they're kept in detention. And until the realities were, I guess, slowed down or theoretically reversed, a lot of situations had those the children with families separated from the parents. And this was initiated last May, in May of 18, announced somewhat gleefully by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who said that this was really just, it was created, the separation policy created to deter people from coming across the border.
He was a champion of this separation policy, Sessions.
A very activist proponent of that separation policy. And the odd thing is that they continued it even knowing that it wasn't actually working to deter families. People kept coming, and the reason they kept coming is that people were leaving the so-called triangle countries of Central America, which is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, where conditions for many, many people were just horrific, terrifying, and deadly, from gangs, from severe poverty, from threats from those governments even, and all of this was very terrifying for families, and they would do anything to get out of those environments, and they were coming across Mexico into the United States. So to your question, so yes, they're in custody theoretically for 72 hours by Border Patrol, which is not a social service agency, it's a law enforcement agency. They're cops, and I met with a number of them when I was down last fall on the border in Texas. And oddly, a lot of these people are family men and women who have their own children at home, and I didn't speak to anyone who was in any way happy about what their jobs actually required them to do. So there was a lot of discomfort, obviously, and then we had reports of fatalities among children who were being kept longer than they should be kept. They were being kept in detention centers, and that was, of course, all kinds of problematic for children and families. The other thing is that if in the case of unaccompanied minors, and especially younger children, they're supposed to be transferred to an agency of not Homeland Security, but Health and Human Services, HHS, where an entity, there's lots of acronyms, but called like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where actually the people would get excellent care by very caring, social workers, nurses, other medical staff, and so on. So I think in the system is the theoretical framework for trying to take care of people who are flooding across the border, but the reality is, because of extraordinary overcrowding and overwhelming of the system, we have stories like CNN put out a few weeks ago that showed those children sleeping outside on concrete and so on.
Now, this might sound a little off topic, but you and I have been discussing off camera this issue of how children are treated in this country. This is obviously an example of, in many cases, egregious treatment of children. But if we look at our education system, there are a lot of kids who are not properly educated. A lot of our schools are in trouble. You began the Children's Health Fund dealing with homeless children in New York City, bringing health care, desperately needed health care, I might add, to these kids. But we still have so many homeless children in this country. Why do we not do a better job as a society in taking care of our own kids?
Well, it's an enigma that we're not even on the verge of solving right now. And when we first started the Children's Health Fund in 1987, on an average night in New York City, there were about 12,000 children with their homeless families living in these horrendous, as you well know, Bob, these horrendous shelters and welfare hotels and so on. Right now, the average nightly census of children in the shelter system is about 25,000.
Oh, my goodness.
So in some ways, although the conditions are better where they are staying, the number is just doubled, essentially. And there's no real end in sight. And I think this is a major concern. One of the other things we talked about off camera was there's two, in a sense, as you put it, existential threats to our nation, but also the planet. One is how not just the U.S., but how the world treats children, and the U.S. in particular, egregious because we have so many resources.
Right.
And the second being climate change and our inability to deal with that. So you have this double-barreled assault on the planet's future. I don't know what's going to come out of this, because I don't really see much prospect for fundamental change here, especially right now.
I don't either. And when we think about climate change, which essentially the problem is global warming, it's goes beyond our inability. It's almost our refusal to engage this issue, to deal with this issue, and it is bizarre.
It sounds deliberate. It's like
I agree.
Oh yeah, we see the problem, but I think we'll just ignore it. And I was just Karen, my wife wants me to stop doing this, but I was reading an article last night about conditions for child exploitation globally in the workforce. You know, child basically labor and near slavery conditions in many countries around the world to produce, you know, our shirts and shoes.
Yep.
And I think there are so many examples, and you don't have to go far from where we're sitting right now to find children who are under the gun, whose futures are being robbed by the conditions and the inability to fix those conditions. I mean, we've been working in the schools, looking at children from disadvantaged communities who have health problems that have never been recognized or treated. So we're finding in a couple of underperforming schools we're working in that about 30% of the children in elementary school classrooms have failed vision tests as we tested them, and didn't have the corrective glasses, the lenses.
Exactly. So I wonder why they're not doing well in the classroom.
What a shock. Yeah. So this is the kind of thing that I think it doesn't take all that much, you know, IQ to kind of understand that there's a relationship between failing our children in a gross and large way and what we should be expecting in the future. When I first started working in the early 1970s in rural Arkansas, you know, I was pretty convinced that, you know, 10, 15 years we'd end child poverty, every kid would have access to care, and here we are, you know, almost 50 years later, still twiddling our thumbs while we have this enormous problem of poverty and everything else that's affecting kids.
Well, the weird thing is that during that period you're talking about, we were making progress in fighting poverty, and you know, fewer people were ending up in poverty, and then it feels like on a lot of these issues we've turned around and started to go backwards. So
yeah, it's you know, the range of let's say number of children and percentage of children in poverty, you know, goes up. It drops a little bit for certain administrations, it goes back up again. But overall, the whole span of time is not encouraging, because we're kind of going up and down in a small, narrow reality. And I think there's a lot more work that we need to be doing.
Now, I mentioned that they are still at the border separating some kids from parents. You mentioned the unaccompanied minors that come in. It's my understanding that some kids who come in very young with close relatives, like grandparents or aunts or uncles, are treated as unaccompanied and
That's true.
Taken into custody. But my question is really, whenever you're taking children away from their parents or guardians, what are some of the harmful effects at work there?
Well, first of all, let me just say that not everybody's who they say they are in terms of the adults. And there's no hiding the fact that there are children being exploited. They're being taken across the border by coyotes. The cartels are now extremely involved in bringing people across. They've told parents that if you give us your kid and you know $8,000 or $9,000, we will take them across the border and then we'll bring you across. So there's serious exploitation of every type you can
So you have
imagine.
people not related to the children bringing children across the border.
Yeah.
So of course these children should be taken into some kind of custody.
And determining who's who in those situations, especially with young children, is extremely difficult. And the older children are threatened if you don't acknowledge the fact or say that we are actually a parent or a relative, we're going to harm your parents or whatever. It's a horrible situation.
Right.
And the Border Patrol, by the way, is caught in the middle. Like I was saying before, a lot of them just loathe what they have to do sometimes, but I'm not sure what the final solution is going to be for this, but it's really, really difficult. But when the child is separated, in fact, even when a child is not separated, and they go into these conditions, these ice boxes, like some of them have to go into or get put into, it is incredibly traumatic. Don't forget, even though where they're coming from was difficult and dangerous and totally impoverished, they're making this crazy trek south to north. They end up here in a very strange environment. under very horrible conditions, and the psychological toll on a lot of these children is tremendous. Usually, the way a child who's experiencing this kind of stress, which we call toxic stress, is protected is by a parent who has got their emotional and physical arms around their child and saying it's going to be okay and reassuring, and that's fine. But when the parents themselves are also intimidated and overwhelmed and uncertain about their own future, it's very difficult for that parent to be a buffer with respect to what's happening to the kids. Some of these children, like the kids who are being abused in the United States, just in terms of general child abuse or witnessing domestic violence, some of these children will suffer lifelong consequences that won't be reversible, mental health and physical health, that put these kids in a really difficult situation.
What happens, it's kind of astounding to me that in some cases there were toddlers and infants who were taken away from parents. What happens to the development of an infant who was taken away from a parent?
Well, it's going to be children, let's say at the youngest, maybe 1 to 5 years old.
They're not really infants.
They're not really infants.
Okay.
But these children, though, are already bonded to their parents. So the disconnection and the breakdown of that bond, because they're separated, and the kids even have less idea, of course, of when they're going to be reunited, is highly traumatic to children. And, you know, the funny thing, Bob, is that everybody knows that. HHS knows it, DHS knows it, the Border Patrol knows it. And by the way, the leadership in the Border Patrol, I was astounded to find people that really cared. They're trying to do something. And one of the reasons I'm working with them is they reached out to me in spite of a lot of criticism I've stated publicly in all kinds of fora. They reached out, can I help them come up with a protocol to assist the Border Patrol agents in identifying those children who might be very sick and need immediate medical care. And I have been, and they've been astoundingly receptive. So it's a complicated issue, but you know, there's things that can be done. But the big picture is not going to be fixed until we address the immigration policies in general. And we're not going to stop it, you know, by walls. This is going to be stopped by helping to change conditions in those 3 countries in Central America in particular, so that people are not being pushed out of their own countries. There'll be incentives to stay there and opportunities there, and that's going to be something that we have to think about as we're looking for a long-term solution.
And the 3 countries we're talking about right now are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, correct? And what are some of the, just briefly, what are some of the conditions that are driving folks away?
So you have people living in let's say, small communities that are not getting any kind of police protection, where the government does not have a resource to do anything about the proliferation of violent gangs in communities who basically are looking for control over a community. There's drug trafficking, prostitution, there's all the stuff that these gangs are doing, and a lot of threats, and a lot of people still being killed by gangs and people being threatened. So living in that environment, trying to just have a normal life, you know, have a job, go to work, raise your family, have the kids go to school. All of those things which we come to view as the normal, appropriate expectations for parents have been eroded and attacked, so that families are hanging out there at the mercy of these violent gangs. So people want to get out of there at any cost, even knowing that it's going to be a difficult and long trek. And when they get to the United States, conditions may be very difficult. I spoke to 42 women in an ICE detention center in El Paso last fall, and to the person, every one of those women said no matter what was happening to them, they would have still come if they knew every detail about what they were going to be facing. And I think that's very telling, that the conditions were so bad that people were willing to take their chances and get to America by any means possible.
In some of these cases, I've been reading and seeing on television of kids who were separated from parents. When they were reunited with the parents, the affect of the children was really interesting. They were, in some cases, wary, upset. It seemed it almost seemed as if in some cases they almost didn't recognize the parents. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So what happens is, for children that have these long traumatic toxically traumatic separations from parents, they have to develop some methodology, some ways of adapting and coping with this. And one of them is to kind of reject their previous bonds with their parents in a way that protects them from missing the parents. Let me just put it that way. So when they finally go back to the parents, first of all, they have no idea why they were separated.
Right.
What do they know?
I would imagine in some cases they would blame the parent.
Yes,
they would think
do.
The parent abandoned them.
Exactly. So there's feelings of abandonment and anger and overwhelming sadness in these children. So the reunification, when it happens, and by the way, there's some cases that can't be reunited because they can't find the parents, which is just a horrific thing to think about. But when the kids do get reunited, for many children, this is a very stressful, difficult time, as it is for the parents. So almost every child that gets reunified after a long separation will need some sort of therapy and counseling, as will the parents that try to facilitate a return to normal. And for some kids, that's not going to happen even.
I would imagine that some of these kids would become profoundly depressed. Does that happen?
Totally true. I mean, they become depressed after they're angry and yelling and begging for their parents, and the parents don't come. They get really very depressed and very detached with behavioral changes that are sort of immediate and situational, but become long-term and sometimes permanent the longer this goes on. And there are these other realities that sometimes the children in these health and human services facilities were they couldn't be comforted by the workers there because there were rules and regulations. You can't touch a child. And, so the kid would be crying, asking for mom, and even a very compassionate social worker or nurse was not allowed to pick up this child and comfort them because of stories about abuse of really older children by workers in some facilities. So they created a blanket rule that undermined the ability of the staff to comfort children who were depressed.
So they carry something that might have made sense in the beginning, but they carry it to an extreme where it then becomes, a negative.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can't give a small kid a hug when he or she is crying. So we have not talked a lot about Donald Trump, mercifully, but
Who's that?
Right? But the president has threatened to restart family separation, and his solution here, he thinks it's been terrible that we ever got rid of some of it. His solution is to lock up the entire family together. Like you can put the parents or the mother or the father in jail, basically, or in custody with the children. We only have a minute or so left, but what do you think of that proposal?
I think these are desperate moves to deal with a situation that requires a much more intelligent, comprehensive overview. These are all really acts of desperation by a president who doesn't really, get the situation, understand what's happening, and therefore is eager to embrace any kind of cockamamie idea that pops into Stephen Miller's mind. And,
right.
It's just a bad situation.
We have to stop there. Dr. Irwin Redlener, thanks so much for coming in.
Pleasure, Bob.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Most of us have seen the photo of the 25 men who voted in the Alabama State Senate to ban virtually all abortions in that state, including in cases of rape or incest. The surge of new, more restrictive abortion laws in southern and border states has prompted nationwide protests at what's been described as a war against women. The laws are indeed extreme, and the legislators passing them are overwhelmingly male, white, and Republican. But supporters of abortion rights would do well to keep in mind the extraordinary hostility to abortion among white women in the states that are passing these laws. It's a mistake to think that this hostility is coming primarily from men. Ronald Brownstein, an exceptionally fine reporter for the Atlantic magazine, writes the following: Strong support from most white women, especially those who identify as evangelical Christians, has helped Republicans dominate local government in the states passing the most restrictive measures, from Alabama and Georgia to Kentucky and Missouri. In some of those states, polling shows that opposition to legal abortion is higher among white women than among white men. Thus, it would be a mistake, or as Brownstein puts it, too simplistic, for proponents of abortion rights to expect these egregious laws to drive a huge wave of women away from the GOP in upcoming elections. I'm a big advocate for protests and demonstrations. By all means, get the word out about what is happening with these laws and about their potential dire consequences. But it's important to keep in mind just how rigidly polarized this country has become. It is not at all easy to draw support away from one side or another. The saving grace for Democrats is that there are more Democrats than Republicans in the United States, a lot more. The key to efforts by abortion rights activists and all other liberal or progressive organizers and advocates is to inform your supporters, educate them, excite them, and more important than anything else, get them to the polls. That's all for now. See you next time.